What's going on YouTube? Listen up, young elder gang. This is billionaire Ted Strokes at you with another banger. Please make sure you like, subscribe, and share this video, fam. I hope this video get at least 100,000 likes. In this video, you will find history, definitions, scripture, information, and best of all, what we Americans have been deprived of from the beginning, the truth. Keep in mind this content used in this video is intended for entertainment, educational, and informational purposes only. We will give you the total truth, as we best understand it today. Be sure to hit that like button, young elder gang. Hit that subscribe button if you're new to the channel. Hit that bell, and don't forget to check back with us every day for new content. The Talmud tells us, Tractate Sukkot 23b, that there are 613 commandments, mitzvot, in the Torah, 248 positive commandments, dos, and 365 negative commandments, do-nots. However, the Talmud does not provide us with a list of these commandments. Several great Jewish scholars have compiled a complete listing of these mitzvahs. Although they all agree on the vast majority of the commandments, they do disagree concerning a number of them. The arguments are for scholastic purposes only, for they do not disagree over any actual commandment, whether it is mandatory or forbidden. They only disagree whether certain commandments are independent commandments, or perhaps they are part of another commandment and are not counted on their own. The following list follows the opinion of Maimonides as he lists them in his magnum opus, the Mishneh Torah. It must be noted that many of these commandments, such as all the commandments associated with sacrifices, are not practicable as long as there is no temple in Jerusalem. The full list of the mitzvot. 1. To know there is a God, Exodus 22:2. Not to entertain thoughts of other gods besides him, Exodus 23:3. To know that he is one, Deuteronomy 6:4. To love him, Deuteronomy 6:5. To fear him, Deuteronomy 10:20. 6. To sanctify his name, Leviticus 22:32. 7. Not to profane his name, Leviticus 22:32. 8. Not to destroy objects associated with his name, Deuteronomy 12:4. 9. To listen to the prophet speaking in his name, Deuteronomy 18:15. 10. Not to test the prophet unduly, Deuteronomy 6:16. 11. To emulate his ways, Deuteronomy 28:9. 12. To cleave to those who know him, Deuteronomy 10:20. 13. To love other Jews, Leviticus 19:18. 14. To love converts, Deuteronomy 10:19. 15. Not to hate fellow Jews, Leviticus 19:17. 16. To reprove wrongdoers, Leviticus 19:17. 17. Not to embarrass others, Leviticus 19:17. 18. Not to oppress the weak, Exodus 22:21. 19. Not to gossip about others, Leviticus 19:16. 20. Not to take revenge, Leviticus 19:18. 1. Not to bear a grudge, Leviticus 19:18-2. To learn Torah and teach it, Deuteronomy 6:7-3. To honor those who teach and know Torah, Leviticus 19:32-4. Not to inquire into idolatry, Leviticus 19:4-5. Not to follow the whims of your heart or what your eyes see, Numbers 15:39-6. Not to blaspheme, Exodus 22:27-7. Not to worship idols in the manner they are worshipped, Exodus 20:5-8. Not to bow down to idols, Exodus 20:5-9. Not to make an idol for yourself, Exodus 20:4-10. Not to make an idol for others, Leviticus 19:4-11. Not to make human forms even for decorative purposes, Exodus 20:12. Not to turn a city to idolatry, Exodus 23:13-13. To burn a city that has turned to idol worship, Deuteronomy 13:17-14. Not to rebuild it as a city, Deuteronomy 13:17-15. Not to derive benefit from it, Deuteronomy 13:18-16. Not to missionize an individual to idol worship, Deuteronomy 13:12-17. Not to love the missionary, Deuteronomy 13:9-18. Not to cease hating the missionary, Deuteronomy 13:9-19. Not to save the missionary, Deuteronomy 13:9-20. Not to say anything in his defense, Deuteronomy 13:9-21. Not to refrain from incriminating him, Deuteronomy 13:9. 1. Not to prophesy in the name of idolatry, Deuteronomy 18:22. Not to listen to a false prophet, Deuteronomy 13:4-3. Not to prophesy falsely in the name of GD, Deuteronomy 18:24. Not to be afraid of killing the false prophet, Deuteronomy 18:22-5. Not to swear in the name of an idol, Exodus 23:13-6. Not to perform OV, medium, Leviticus 19:31-7. Not to perform Yidoni, magical seer. Leviticus 19:31-8. Not to pass your children through the fire to Molech. Leviticus 18:21-9. Not to erect a column in a public place of worship. Deuteronomy 16:22-10. Not to bow down on smooth stone. Leviticus 26:1-11. Not to plant a tree in the temple courtyard. Deuteronomy 16:21-12. To destroy idols and their accessories. Deuteronomy 12:2-13. Not to derive benefit from idols and their accessories. Deuteronomy 7:26-14. Not to derive benefit from ornaments of idols. Deuteronomy 7:25-15. Not to make a covenant with idolaters. Deuteronomy 7:2-16. Not to show favor to them. Deuteronomy 7:2-17. Not to let them dwell in our land. Exodus 23:33-18. Not to imitate them in customs and clothing. Leviticus 20:23-19. Not to be superstitious. Leviticus 19:26-20. Not to go into a trance to foresee events, etc. Deuteronomy 18:10-21. Not to engage in astrology. Leviticus 19:26. 1. Not to mutter incantations. Deuteronomy 18:11-2. Not to attempt to engage the dead in conversation. Deuteronomy 18:11-3. Not to consult the Ov. Deuteronomy 18:11-4. Not to consult the Yidoni. Deuteronomy 18:11-5. Not to perform acts of magic. Deuteronomy 18:10-6. Men must not shave the hair off the sides of their head. Leviticus 19:27-7. Men must not shave their beards with a razor. Leviticus 19:27-8. Men must not wear women's clothing. Deuteronomy 22:5-9. Women must not wear men's clothing. Deuteronomy 22:5-10. Not to tattoo the skin. Leviticus 19:28-11. Not to tear the skin in mourning. Deuteronomy 14:1-12. Not to make a bald spot in mourning. Deuteronomy 14:1-13. To repent and confess wrongdoings. Numbers 5:7-14. To say the Shema twice daily. Deuteronomy 6:7-15. To serve the Almighty with prayer daily. Exodus 23:25-16. The Kohanim must bless the Jewish nation daily. Numbers 6:23-17. To wear tefillin on the head. Deuteronomy 6:8-18. To bind tefillin on the arm. Deuteronomy 6:8-19. To put a mezuzah on each doorpost. Deuteronomy 6:9-20. To write a sefer Torah. Deuteronomy 31:19-21. The king must have a separate sefer Torah for himself. Deuteronomy 17:18. 1. To have tzitzit on four-cornered garments. Numbers 15:38-2. To bless the Almighty after eating. Deuteronomy 8:10-3. To circumcise all males on the 8th day after their birth. Leviticus 12:3-4. To rest on the 7th day. Exodus 23:12-5. Not to do prohibited labor on the 7th day. Exodus 20:10-6. The court must not inflict punishment on Shabbat. Exodus 35:3-7. Not to walk more than 2,000 cubits outside the city boundary on Shabbat. Exodus 16:29-8. To sanctify the day with Kiddush and Havdalah. Exodus 28:9. To rest from prohibited labor on Yom Kippur. Leviticus 23:32-10. Not to do prohibited labor on Yom Kippur. Leviticus 23:31-11. To afflict yourself on Yom Kippur. Leviticus 16:29-12. Not to eat or drink on Yom Kippur. Leviticus 23:29-13. To rest on the first day of Passover. Leviticus 23:8-14. Not to do prohibited labor on the first day of Passover. Leviticus 23:8-15. To rest on the 7th day of Passover. Leviticus 23:8-16. Not to do prohibited labor on the 7th day of Passover. Leviticus 23:8-17. To rest on Shavuot. Leviticus 23:21-18. Not to do prohibited labor on Shavuot. Leviticus 23:21-19. To rest on Rosh Hashanah. Leviticus 23:24-20. Not to do prohibited labor on Rosh Hashanah. Leviticus 23:25-21. To rest on Sukkot. Leviticus 23:35. 1. Not to do prohibited labor on Sukkot. Leviticus 23:35-2. To rest on Shemini Atzeret. Leviticus 23:36-3. Not to do prohibited labor on Shemini Atzeret. Leviticus 23:36-4. Not to eat shemetz on the afternoon of the 14th day of Nisan. Deuteronomy 16:3-5. To destroy all shemetz on 14th day of Nisan. Exodus 12:15-6. Not to eat shemetz all 7 days of Passover. Exodus 13:3-7. Not to eat mixtures containing shemetz all 7 days of Passover. Exodus 12:28. Chametz should not be seen in your domain 7 days. Exodus 13, 7-9. Chametz should not be found in your domain 7 days. Exodus 12, 19-10. To eat matzah on the first night of Passover. Exodus 12, 18-11. To relate the exodus from Egypt on that night. Exodus 13, 8-12. To hear the shofar on the first day of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah. Numbers 29, 1-13. To dwell in a sukkah for the 7 days of Sukkot. Leviticus 23, 42-14. To take up a lulav and etrog all 7 days of Sukkot. Leviticus 23, 40-15. Each man must give a half shekel annually. Exodus 30, 13-16. Courts must calculate to determine when a new month begins. Exodus 12, 2-17. To afflict and cry out before GD in times of catastrophe. Numbers 10, 9-18. To marry a wife by the means prescribed in the Torah, Kiddushin. Deuteronomy 24, 1-19. Not to have relations with women not thus married. Deuteronomy 23, 18-20. Not to withhold food, clothing, and sexual relations from your wife. Exodus 21, 10-21. To have children with one's wife. Genesis 1, 28-22. To issue a divorce by means of a get document. Deuteronomy 24, 1-23. A man must not remarry his wife after she has married someone else. Deuteronomy 24, 4-24. To do yibum, marry childless brother's widow. Deuteronomy 25, 5-25. To do chalitza, freeing a widow from yibum. Deuteronomy 25, 9. 1. The widow must not remarry until the ties with her brother-in-law are removed. Deuteronomy 25, 5-2. The court must fine one who seduces a maiden. Exodus 22, 15, 16-3. The rapist must marry the maiden if she chooses. Deuteronomy 22, 29-4. He is not allowed to divorce her. Deuteronomy 22, 29-5. The slanderer must remain married to the wife he slandered. Deuteronomy 22, 19-6. He must not divorce her. Deuteronomy 22, 19-7. To fulfill the laws of the woman suspected of adultery. Sotah. Numbers 5:38. Not to put oil on her meal offering. Numbers 5:15-9. Not to put frankincense on her meal offering. Numbers 5:15-10. Not to have sexual relations with your mother. Leviticus 18:7-11. Not to have sexual relations with your father's wife. Leviticus 18:8-12. Not to have sexual relations with your sister. Leviticus 18:9-13. Not to have sexual relations with your father's wife's daughter, from your father. Leviticus 18:11-14. Not to have sexual relations with your son's daughter. Leviticus 18:10-15. Not to have sexual relations with your daughter. Leviticus 18:10-16. Not to have sexual relations with your daughter's daughter. Leviticus 18:10-17. Not to marry a woman and her daughter. Leviticus 18:17-18. Not to marry a woman and her son's daughter. Leviticus 18:17-19. Not to marry a woman and her daughter's daughter. Leviticus 18:17-20. Not to have sexual relations with your father's sister. Leviticus 18:12-21. Not to have sexual relations with your mother's sister. Leviticus 18:13-22. Not to have sexual relations with your father's brother's wife. Leviticus 18:14-23. Not to have sexual relations with your son's wife. Leviticus 18:15-24. Not to have sexual relations with your brother's wife. Leviticus 18:16-25. Not to have sexual relations with your wife's sister. Leviticus 18:18-26. A man must not have sexual relations with a beast. Leviticus 18:23-27. A woman must not have sexual relations with a beast. Leviticus 18:23. 1. Not to have homosexual sexual relations. Leviticus 18:22-2. Not to have homosexual sexual relations with your father. Leviticus 18:7-3. Not to have homosexual sexual relations with your father's brother. Leviticus 18:14-4. Not to have sexual relations with a married woman. Leviticus 18:25. Not to have sexual relations with a menstrually impure woman. Leviticus 18:19-6. Not to marry non-Jews. Deuteronomy 7:3-7. Not to let Moabite and Ammonite males marry into the Jewish people. Deuteronomy 23:4-8. Don't keep a third-generation Egyptian convert from marrying into the Jewish people. Deuteronomy 23:8-9-1. Not to refrain from marrying a third-generation Edomite convert. Deuteronomy 23:8-9-2. Not to let a mamzer, bastard, marry into the Jewish people. Deuteronomy 23:3-3. Not to let a eunuch marry into the Jewish people. Deuteronomy 23:2-4. Not to castrate any male, including animals. Leviticus 22:24-5. The high priest must not marry a widow. Leviticus 21:14-6. The high priest must not have sexual relations with a widow even outside of marriage. Leviticus 21:14-7. The high priest must marry a virgin maiden. Leviticus 21:13-8. A Cohen must not marry a divorcee. Leviticus 21:7-9. A Cohen must not marry a Zona, a woman who had forbidden relations. Leviticus 21:7-10. A Cohen must not marry a Chalala, party to or product of 169, 172, Leviticus 21:7-11. Not to make pleasurable sexual contact with any forbidden woman, Leviticus 18:6-12. To examine the signs of animals to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher, Leviticus 11:2-13. To examine the signs of fowl to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher, Deuteronomy 14:11-14. To examine the signs of fish to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher, Leviticus 11:9-15. To examine the signs of locusts to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher, Leviticus 11:21-16. Not to eat non-kosher animals, Leviticus 11:4-17. Not to eat non-kosher fowl, Leviticus 11:13-18. Not to eat non-kosher fish, Leviticus 11:11-19. Not to eat non-kosher flying insects, Deuteronomy 14:19-20. Not to eat non-kosher creatures that crawl on land, Leviticus 11:41-21. Not to eat non-kosher maggots, Leviticus 11:44-22. Not to eat worms found in fruit once they have left the fruit, Leviticus 11:42-23. Not to eat creatures that live in water other than fish, Leviticus 11:43-24. Not to eat the meat of an animal that died without ritual slaughter, Deuteronomy 14:21-25. Not to benefit from a beast condemned to be stoned, Exodus 21:28-26. Not to eat meat of an animal that was mortally wounded, Exodus 22:30-27. Not to eat a limb torn off a living creature, Deuteronomy 12:23-28. Not to eat blood, Leviticus 3:17-29. Not to eat certain fats of kosher animals, Leviticus 3:17-30. Not to eat the sinew of the thigh, Genesis 32:33. 1. Not to eat meat and milk cooked together, Exodus 23:19-1. Not to cook meat and milk together, Exodus 34:26-2. Not to eat bread from new grain before the Omer, Leviticus 23:14-3. Not to eat parched grains from new grain before the Omer, Leviticus 23:14-4. Not to eat ripened grains from new grain before the Omer, Leviticus 23:14-5. Not to eat fruit of a tree during its first 3 years, Leviticus 19:23-6. Not to eat diverse seeds planted in a vineyard, Deuteronomy 22:9-7. Not to eat untithed fruits, Leviticus 22:15-8. Not to drink wine poured in service to idols, Deuteronomy 32:38-9. To ritually slaughter an animal before eating it, Deuteronomy 12:21-10. Not to slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day, Leviticus 22:28-11. To cover the blood of a slaughtered beast or fowl with earth, Leviticus 17:13-12. Not to take the mother bird from her children, Deuteronomy 22:6-13. To release the mother bird before taking the children, Deuteronomy 22:7-14. Not to swear falsely in GD's name, Leviticus 19:12-15. Not to take GD's name in vain, Exodus 27:16. Not to deny possession of something entrusted to you, Leviticus 19:11-17. Not to swear falsely in denial of a monetary claim, Leviticus 19:11-18. To swear in GD's name to confirm the truth when deemed necessary by court, Deuteronomy 10:20-19. To fulfill what was uttered and to do what was avowed, Deuteronomy 23:24-20. Not to break oaths or vows, Numbers 30:3-21. For oaths and vows annulled, there are the laws of annulling vows explicit in the Torah, Numbers 30:3-22. The Nazir must let his hair grow, Numbers 6:5-23. He must not cut his hair, Numbers 6:5-24. He must not drink wine, wine mixtures, or wine vinegar, Numbers 6:3-25. He must not eat fresh grapes, Numbers 6:3-1. He must not eat raisins, Numbers 6:3-2. He must not eat grape seeds, Numbers 6:4-3. He must not eat grape skins, Numbers 6:4-1. He must not be under the same roof as a corpse, Numbers 6:6-2. He must not come into contact with the dead, Numbers 6:7-3. He must shave after bringing sacrifices upon completion of his Nazirite period, Numbers 6:18-4. To estimate the value of people when someone pledges a person's worth, as determined by the Torah, Leviticus 27:2-5. To estimate the value of consecrated animals, Leviticus 27:12-13:6. To estimate the value of consecrated houses, Leviticus 27:14-7. To estimate the value of consecrated fields, Leviticus 27:16-8. Carry out the laws of interdicting possessions, cherem, Leviticus 27:28-9. Not to sell the cherem, Leviticus 27:28-10. Not to redeem the cherem, Leviticus 27:28-11. Not to plant diverse seeds together, Leviticus 19:19-12. Not to plant grains or greens in a vineyard, Deuteronomy 22:9-13. Not to crossbreed animals, Leviticus 19:19-14. Not to work different animals together, Deuteronomy 22:10-15. Not to wear shatnez, a cloth woven of wool and linen, Deuteronomy 22:11-16. To leave a corner of the field uncut for the poor, Leviticus 19:10-17. Not to reap that corner, Leviticus 19:9-18. To leave gleanings for the poor, Leviticus 19:9-19. Not to gather the gleanings, Leviticus 19:9-1. To leave the gleanings of a vineyard, Leviticus 19:10-2. Not to gather the gleanings of a vineyard, Leviticus 19:10-3. To leave the unformed clusters of grapes for the poor, Leviticus 19:10-4. Not to pick the unformed clusters of grapes, Leviticus 19:10-5. To leave the forgotten sheaves in the field for the poor, Deuteronomy 24:19-6. Not to retrieve them, Deuteronomy 24:19-1. To separate the tithe for the poor, Deuteronomy 14:28-2. To give charity, Deuteronomy 15:11-3. Not to withhold charity from the poor, Deuteronomy 15:7-4. To set aside teruma gedola, tithe for the Kohen, Deuteronomy 18:4-5. The Levite must set aside a tenth of his tithe for the Kohen, Numbers 18:26-1. Not to improperly preface one tithe to the next, but separate them in their proper order, Exodus 22:28-2. A non-Kohen must not eat teruma, Leviticus 22:10-3. A hired worker or a Jewish bondsman of a Kohen must not eat teruma, Leviticus 22:10-4. An uncircumcised Kohen must not eat teruma, Exodus 12:48-5. An impure Kohen must not eat teruma, Leviticus 22:4-6. A chalalasi mitzvah 174 must not eat teruma, Leviticus 22:12-7. To set aside ma'aser, tithe, each planting year and give it to a Levite, Numbers 18:24-8. To set aside the second tithe, which is to be eaten in Jerusalem, Deuteronomy 14:22-9. Not to spend its redemption money on anything but food, drink, or ointment, Deuteronomy 26:14-10. Not to eat the second tithe while impure, Deuteronomy 26:14-1. A mourner on the first day after death must not eat the second tithe, Deuteronomy 26:14-2. Not to eat second tithe grains outside Jerusalem, Deuteronomy 12:17-3. Not to eat second tithe wine products outside Jerusalem, Deuteronomy 12:17-4. Not to eat second tithe oil outside Jerusalem, Deuteronomy 12:17-5. The fourth year crops must be totally for holy purposes like the second tithe, Leviticus 19:24-6. To read the confession of tithes every fourth and seventh year, Deuteronomy 26:13-7. To set aside the first fruits and bring them to the temple, Exodus 23:19-8. The Kohanim must not eat the first fruits outside Jerusalem, Deuteronomy 12:17-1. To read the Torah portion pertaining to their presentation, Deuteronomy 26:5-2. To set aside a portion of dough for a Kohen, Numbers 15:23. To give the shoulder, 2 cheeks, and stomach of slaughtered animals to a Kohen, Deuteronomy 18:3-4. To give the first shearing of sheep to a Kohen, Deuteronomy 18:4-5. To redeem the firstborn sons and give the money to a Kohen, Numbers 18:15-6. To redeem the firstborn donkey by giving a lamb to a Kohen, Exodus 13:13-7. To break the neck of the donkey if the owner does not intend to redeem it, Exodus 13:13-8. To rest the land during the 7th year by not doing any work which enhances growth, Exodus 34:21-9. Not to work the land during the 7th year, Leviticus 25:4-10. Not to work with trees to produce fruit during that year, Leviticus 25:4-1. Not to reap crops that grow wild that year in the normal manner, Leviticus 25:5-2. Not to gather grapes which grow wild that year in the normal way, Leviticus 25:5-3. To leave free all produce which grew in that year, Exodus 23:11-4. To release all loans during the 7th year, Deuteronomy 15:3-1. Not to pressure or claim from the borrower, Deuteronomy 15:2-2. not to refrain from lending immediately before the release of the loans for fear of monetary loss. Deuteronomy 15:9-3. The Sanhedrin must count 7 groups of 7 years. Leviticus 25:8-4. The Sanhedrin must sanctify the 50th Jubilee year. Leviticus 25:10-1. To blow the shofar on the 10th of Tishrei, Yom Kippur of the Jubilee year, to free the slaves. Leviticus 25:9-2. Not to work the soil during the 50th year. Leviticus 25:11-1. Not to reap in the normal manner that which grows wild in the 50th year. Leviticus 25:11-2. Not to pick grapes which grew wild in the normal manner in the 50th year. Leviticus 25:11-3. Carry out the laws of sold family properties. Leviticus 25:24-4. Not to sell the land in Israel indefinitely. Leviticus 25:23-1. Carry out the laws of houses in walled cities. Leviticus 25:29-2. The tribe of Levi must not be given a portion of the land in Israel, rather they are given cities to dwell in. Deuteronomy 18:2-3. The Levites must not take a share in the spoils of war. Deuteronomy 18:1-4. To give the Levites cities to inhabit and their surrounding fields. Numbers 35:2-5. Not to sell the fields, but they shall remain the Levites before and after the Jubilee year. Leviticus 25:34-6. To build a sanctuary, holy temple. Exodus 25:8-1. Not to build the altar with stones hewn by metal. Exodus 20:22-2. Not to climb steps to the altar. Exodus 20:23-3. To show reverence for the temple. Leviticus 19:34. To guard the temple area. Numbers 18:3-5. Not to leave the temple unguarded. Numbers 18:5-6. To prepare the anointing oil. Exodus 30:31-7. Not to reproduce the anointing oil for personal use. Exodus 30:32-8. Not to anoint with anointing oil, a non-Cohen or non-king. Exodus 30:32-1. Not to reproduce the incense formula for personal use. Exodus 30:37-2. Not to burn anything on the golden altar besides incense. Exodus 30:9-3. The Levites must transport the ark on their shoulders. Numbers 7:9-4. Not to remove the staves from the ark. Exodus 25:15-5. The Levites must work in the temple. Numbers 18:23-6. No Levite must do another's work of either a Cohen or a Levite. Numbers 18:3-7. To dedicate the Cohen for service. Leviticus 21:8-1. The Cohen work shifts must be equal during holidays. Deuteronomy 18:6-8-2. The Kohanim must wear their priestly garments during service. Exodus 28:2-3. Not to tear the priestly garments. Exodus 28:32-4. The high priest's breastplate must not be loosened from the ephod, priestly apron. Exodus 28:1. A Cohen must not enter the temple intoxicated. Leviticus 10:9-2. A Cohen must not enter the temple with long hair. Leviticus 10:6-3. A Cohen must not enter the temple with torn clothes. Leviticus 10:6-1. A Cohen must not enter the sanctuary of the temple indiscriminately. Leviticus 16:2-2. A Cohen must not leave the temple during service. Leviticus 10:7-3. To send the impure from the temple. Numbers 5:2-4. Impure people must not enter the temple. Numbers 5:3-1. Certain impure people must not enter even the Temple Mount area. Deuteronomy 23:11-2. Impure Kohanim must not do service in the temple. Leviticus 22:2-3. An impure Cohen, following immersion, must wait until after sundown before returning to service. Leviticus 21:6-4. A Cohen must wash his hands and feet before service. Exodus 30:19-1. A Cohen with a physical blemish must not enter the sanctuary or approach the altar. Leviticus 21:23-2. A Cohen with a physical blemish must not serve. Leviticus 21:17-3. A Cohen with a temporary blemish must not serve. Leviticus 21:18-4. One who is not a Cohen must not serve. Numbers 18:4-1. To offer only unblemished animals. Leviticus 22:21-2. Not to dedicate a blemished animal for the altar. Leviticus 22:23. Not to slaughter it. Leviticus 22:22-4. Not to sprinkle its blood. Leviticus 22:24-5. Not to burn its fat. Leviticus 22:22-6. Not to offer a temporarily blemished animal. Deuteronomy 17:1-1. Not to sacrifice blemished animals even if offered by non-Jews. Leviticus 22:25-2. Not to inflict wounds upon dedicated animals. Leviticus 22:21-3. To redeem dedicated animals which have become disqualified. Deuteronomy 12:15-4. To offer only animals which are at least 8 days old. Leviticus 22:27-5. Not to offer animals bought with the wages of a harlot or the animal exchanged for a dog. Deuteronomy 23:19-6. Not to burn honey or yeast on the altar. Leviticus 2:11-1. To salt all sacrifices. Leviticus 2:13-2. Not to omit the salt from sacrifices. Leviticus 2:13-3. Carry out the procedure of the burnt offering as prescribed in the Torah. Leviticus 1:3. On. Not to eat its meat. Deuteronomy 12:17-2. Carry out the procedure of the sin offering. Leviticus 6:18-1. Not to eat the meat of the inner sin offering. Leviticus 6:23-2. Not to decapitate a fowl brought as a sin offering. Leviticus 5:8-3. Carry out the procedure of the guilt offering. Leviticus 7:1-4. The Kohanim must eat the sacrificial meat in the temple. Exodus 29:33-5. The Kohanim must not eat the meat outside the temple courtyard. Deuteronomy 12:17-6. A non-Kohen must not eat certain sacrificial meats. Exodus 29:33-1. To follow the procedure of the peace offering. Leviticus 7:11-2. Not to eat the meat of minor sacrifices before sprinkling the blood. Deuteronomy 12:17-3. To bring meal offerings as prescribed in the Torah. Leviticus 2:1-4. Not to put oil on the meal offerings of wrongdoers. Leviticus 5:11-5. Not to put frankincense on the meal offerings of wrongdoers. Leviticus 5:11-6. The meal offering of a priest should not be eaten. Leviticus 6:16-7. Not to bake a meal offering as leavened bread. Leviticus 6:10-1. The Kohanim must eat the remains of the meal offerings. Leviticus 6:9-2. To bring all avowed and free will offerings to the temple on the first subsequent festival. Deuteronomy 12:5-6-3. Not to withhold payment incurred by any vow. Deuteronomy 23:22-1. To offer all sacrifices in the temple. Deuteronomy 12:11-2. To bring all sacrifices from outside Israel to the temple. Deuteronomy 12:26-3. Not to slaughter sacrifices outside the courtyard. Leviticus 17:4-4. Not to offer any sacrifices outside the courtyard. Deuteronomy 12:13-5. To offer 2 lambs every day. Numbers 28:3. 1. To light a fire on the altar every day. Leviticus 6:5-2. Not to extinguish this fire. Leviticus 6:5-1. To remove the ashes from the altar every day. Leviticus 6:3-2. To burn incense every day. Exodus 30:7-3. To light the menorah every day. Exodus 27:21-4. The high priest must bring a meal offering every day. Leviticus 6:13-5. To bring 2 additional lambs as burnt offerings on Shabbat. Numbers 28:9-6. To make the showbread. Exodus 25:31. To bring additional offerings on the new month. Rosh Chodesh. Numbers 28:11-2. To bring additional offerings on Passover. Numbers 28:19-1. To offer the wave offering from the meal of the new wheat on the second day of Passover. Leviticus 23:10-2. Each man must count the omer, 7 weeks from the day the new wheat offering was brought. Leviticus 23:15-3. To bring additional offerings on Shavuot. Numbers 28:26-4. To bring 2 loaves to accompany the above sacrifice. Leviticus 23:18-1. To bring additional offerings on Rosh Hashanah. Numbers 29:2-2. To bring additional offerings on Yom Kippur. Numbers 29:8-3. To bring additional offerings on Sukkot. Numbers 29:13-4. To bring additional offerings on Shmini Atzeret. Numbers 29:35-5. Not to eat sacrifices which have become unfit or blemished. Deuteronomy 14:3-6. Not to eat from sacrifices offered with improper intentions. Leviticus 7:18-1. Not to leave sacrifices past the time allowed for eating them. Leviticus 22:32. Not to eat from that which was left over. Leviticus 19:8-3. Not to eat from sacrifices which became impure. Leviticus 7:19-4. An impure person must not eat from sacrifices. Leviticus 7:25. To burn the leftover sacrifices. Leviticus 7:17-6. To burn all impure sacrifices. Leviticus 7:19-7. To follow the procedure of Yom Kippur in the sequence prescribed in the Torah. Leviticus 16:3-8. One who profaned holy property must repay what he profaned plus a fifth and bring a sacrifice. Leviticus 5:16-9. Not to work consecrated animals. Deuteronomy 15:19-10. Not to shear the fleece of consecrated animals. Deuteronomy 15:19-11. To slaughter the paschal sacrifice at the specified time. Exodus 12:6-12. Not to slaughter it while in possession of leaven. Exodus 23:18-13. Not to leave the fat overnight. Exodus 23:18-1. To slaughter the second Paschal lamb. Numbers 9:11-2. To eat the Paschal lamb with matzah and maror on the night of the 15th of Nisan. Exodus 12:8-3. To eat the second Paschal lamb on the night of the 15th of Iyar. Numbers 9:11-4. Not to eat the Paschal meat raw or boiled. Exodus 12:9-5. Not to take the Paschal meat from the confines of its group. Exodus 12:46-6. An apostate must not eat from it. Exodus 12:43-7. A permanent or temporary non-Jewish hired worker must not eat from it. Exodus 12:45-1. An uncircumcised male must not eat from it. Exodus 12:48-2. Not to break any bones from the Paschal offering. Exodus 12:46. 1. Not to break any bones from the second Paschal offering. Numbers 9:12-2. Not to leave any meat from the Paschal offering over until morning. Exodus 12:10-1. Not to leave the second Paschal meat over until morning. Numbers 9:12-2. Not to leave the meat of the holiday offering of the 14th until the 16th. Deuteronomy 16:4-3. To be seen at the temple on Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Deuteronomy 16:16-4. To celebrate on these three festivals by bringing an offering. Exodus 23:14-5. To rejoice on these three festivals. Deuteronomy 16:14-6. Not to appear at the temple without offerings. Deuteronomy 16:16-1. Not to refrain from rejoicing with and giving gifts to the Levites. Deuteronomy 12:19-2. To assemble all the people on the Sukkot following the 7th year, the king publicly reads portions of the Torah. Deuteronomy 31:12-3. To set aside the firstborn animals to be eaten by the Kohanim and sacrificed unless they are blemished. Exodus 13:12-1. The Kohanim must not eat unblemished firstborn animals outside Jerusalem. Deuteronomy 12:17-2. Not to redeem the firstborn. Numbers 18:17-3. Separate the tithe from animals to be eaten by the Kohanim and sacrificed unless they are blemished. Leviticus 27:32-4. Not to redeem the tithe. Leviticus 27:33-5. Every person must bring a sin offering for his transgression. Leviticus 4:27-6. Bring an Asham Talui offering when uncertain of guilt. Leviticus 5:17, 18:7. Bring an Asham Vadai offering for certain sins when guilt is ascertained. Leviticus 5:25-8. Bring an Ola Veard offering, if the person is wealthy, an animal, if poor, a bird or meal offering, for certain sins. Leviticus 5:7, 11:9. The Sanhedrin must bring an offering when it rules in error. Leviticus 4:13-10. A woman who had a running issue must bring an offering after she goes to the mikvah. Leviticus 15:28, 29:11. A woman who gave birth must bring an offering after she goes to the mikvah. Leviticus 12:6-12. A man who had a running issue must bring an offering after he goes to the mikvah. Leviticus 15:13, 14:13. A metzora, leprous person, see according to the Torah, is leprosy a hygienic problem or is it something spiritual and miraculous? Must bring an offering after going to the mikvah. Leviticus 14:10-14. Not to substitute another beast for one set apart for sacrifice. Leviticus 27:10-15. The new animal, in addition to the substituted one, retains consecration. Leviticus 27:10-16. Not to change consecrated animals from one type of offering to another. Leviticus 27:26-17. Carry out the laws of impurity of the dead. Numbers 19:14-18. Carry out the procedure of the red heifer. Numbers 19:9-19. Carry out the laws of the sprinkling water of the red heifer. Numbers 19:21-20. Rule the laws of human zara'at, leprosy, see Mitzvah 439, as prescribed in the Torah. Leviticus 13:12-21. The metzora, leper, must not remove his signs of impurity. Deuteronomy 24:8-22. The metzora must not shave signs of impurity in his hair. Leviticus 13:33-23. The metzora must publicize his condition by tearing his garments, allowing his hair to grow and covering his mustache. Leviticus 13:45. 1. Carry out the prescribed rules for purifying the metzora. Leviticus 14:2-2. The metzora must shave off all his hair prior to purification. Leviticus 14:9-3. Carry out the laws of leprous clothing. Leviticus 13:47-4. Carry out the laws of leprous houses. Leviticus 14:35-5. Observe the laws of menstrual impurity. Leviticus 15:19-6. Observe the laws of impurity caused by childbirth. Leviticus 12:2-7. Observe the laws of impurity caused by a woman's running issue. Leviticus 15:25-1. Observe the laws of impurity caused by a man's running issue, irregular ejaculation of infected semen. Leviticus 15:3-2. Observe the laws of impurity caused by a dead beast. Leviticus 11:39-3. Observe the laws of impurity caused by the 8 shratzim, rodents, amphibious creatures, and lizards specified in the Torah. Leviticus 11:29-1. Observe the laws of impurity of a seminal emission, regular ejaculation with normal semen. Leviticus 15:16-2. Observe the laws of impurity concerning liquid and solid foods. Leviticus 11:34-3. Every impure person must immerse himself in a mikvah to become pure. Leviticus 15:16-4. The court must judge the damages incurred by a goring beast. Exodus 21:28-5. The court must judge the damages incurred by an animal eating. Exodus 22:4-6. The court must judge the damages incurred by a pit. Exodus 21:33-1. The court must judge the damages incurred by fire. Exodus 22:5-2. Not to steal money stealthily. Leviticus 19:11-3. The court must implement punitive measures against the thief. Exodus 21:37-1. Each individual must ensure that his scales and weights are accurate. Leviticus 19:36-2. Not to commit injustice with scales and weights. Leviticus 19:35-3. Not to possess inaccurate scales and weights even if they are not for use. Deuteronomy 25:13-4. Not to move a boundary marker to steal someone's property. Deuteronomy 19:14-1. Not to kidnap. Exodus 20:13-2. Not to rob. Leviticus 19:13-3. Not to withhold wages or fail to repay a debt. Leviticus 19:13-1. Not to covet and scheme to acquire another's possession. Exodus 20:14-2. Not to desire another's possession. Deuteronomy 5:18-3. Return the robbed object or its value. Leviticus 5:23-4. Not to ignore a lost object. Deuteronomy 22:3-5. Return the lost object. Deuteronomy 22:1-1. The court must implement laws against the one who assaults another or damages another's property. Exodus 21:18-2. Not to murder. Exodus 20:13-3. Not to accept monetary restitution to atone for the murderer. Numbers 35:31. 1. The court must send the accidental murderer to a city of refuge. Numbers 35:25-2. Not to accept monetary restitution instead of being sent to a city of refuge. Numbers 35:32-1. Not to kill the murderer before he stands trial. Numbers 35:12-2. Save someone being pursued even by taking the life of the pursuer. Deuteronomy 25:12-3. Not to pity the pursuer. Numbers 35:12-1. Not to stand idly by if someone's life is in danger. Leviticus 19:16-2. Designate cities of refuge and prepare routes of access. Deuteronomy 19:3-3. Break the neck of a calf by a stream following an unsolved murder. Deuteronomy 21:4-4. To neither work nor plant that river valley. Deuteronomy 21:4-5. Not to allow pitfalls and obstacles to remain on your property. Deuteronomy 22:8-6. Make a guardrail around flat roofs. Deuteronomy 22:8-7. Not to put a stumbling block before a blind man, nor give harmful advice. Leviticus 19:14-8. Help another remove the load from a beast which can no longer carry it. Exodus 23:5-9. Help others load their beast. Deuteronomy 22:4-10. Not to leave others distraught with their burdens, but to help either load or unload. Deuteronomy 22:4-11. Buy and sell according to Torah law. Leviticus 25:14-12. Not to overcharge or underpay for an article. Leviticus 25:14-1. Not to insult or harm anybody with words. Leviticus 25:17-2. Not to cheat a sincere convert monetarily. Exodus 22:23. Not to insult or harm a sincere convert with words. Exodus 22:24. Purchase a Hebrew slave in accordance with the prescribed laws. Exodus 21:2-5. Not to sell him as a slave is sold. Leviticus 25:42. 1. Not to work him oppressively. Leviticus 25:43-2. Not to allow a non-Jew to work him oppressively. Leviticus 25:53-3. Not to have him do menial slave labor. Leviticus 25:39-4. Give him gifts when he goes free. Deuteronomy 15:14-5. Not to send him away empty-handed. Deuteronomy 15:13-6. Redeem Jewish maidservants. Exodus 21:8-7. Betroth the Jewish maidservant. Exodus 21:8-8. The master must not sell his maidservant. Exodus 21, 8-9. Canaanite slaves must work forever unless the owner amputates one of their limbs. Leviticus 25, 46-10. Not to extradite a slave who fled to biblical Israel. Deuteronomy 23:16-1. Not to wrong a slave who has come to Israel for refuge. Deuteronomy 23:17-2. The courts must carry out the laws of a hired worker and hired guard. Exodus 22:9-3. Pay wages on the day they were earned. Deuteronomy 24:15-1. Not to delay payment of wages past the agreed time. Leviticus 19:13-2. The hired worker may eat from the unharvested crops where he works. Deuteronomy 23:25-3. The worker must not eat while on hired time. Deuteronomy 23:26-1. The worker must not take more than he can eat. Deuteronomy 23:25-2. Not to muzzle an ox while plowing. Deuteronomy 25:4-3. The courts must carry out the laws of a borrower. Exodus 22:13-1. The courts must carry out the laws of an unpaid guard. Exodus 22:6-2. Lend to the poor and destitute. Exodus 22:24-3. Not to press them for payment if you know they don't have it. Exodus 22:24-4. Press the idolater for payment. Deuteronomy 15:3-1. The creditor must not forcibly take collateral. Deuteronomy 24:10-2. Return the collateral to the debtor when needed. Deuteronomy 24:13-3. Not to delay its return when needed. Deuteronomy 24:12-1. Not to demand collateral from a widow. Deuteronomy 24:17-2. Not to demand as collateral utensils needed for preparing food. Deuteronomy 24:6-3. Not to lend with interest. Leviticus 25:37-4. Not to borrow with interest. Deuteronomy 23:25. Not to intermediate in an interest loan, guarantee, witness, or write the promissory note. Exodus 22:24-1. Lend to and borrow from idolaters with interest. Deuteronomy 23:21-2. The courts must carry out the laws of the plaintiff, admitter, or denier. Exodus 22:8-3. Carry out the laws of the order of inheritance. Numbers 27:8-4. Appoint judges. Deuteronomy 16:18-5. Not to appoint judges who are not familiar with judicial procedure. Deuteronomy 1:17-6. Decide by majority in case of disagreement. Exodus 23:2-7. In capital cases, the court must not execute through a majority of one, at least a majority of two is required. Exodus 23:2-8. A judge who presented an acquittal plea must not present an argument for conviction in capital cases. Exodus 23:2-9. The courts must carry out the death penalty of stoning. Deuteronomy 22:24-1. The courts must carry out the death penalty of burning. Leviticus 20:14-2. The courts must carry out the death penalty of the sword. Exodus 21:23. The courts must carry out the death penalty of strangulation. Leviticus 20:10-4. The courts must hang those stoned for blasphemy or idolatry. Deuteronomy 21:22-5. Bury the executed as well as all deceased on the day they are killed. Deuteronomy 21:23-6. Not to delay burial overnight. Deuteronomy 21:23-7. The court must not let the sorcerer live. Exodus 22:17-1. The court must give lashes to the wrongdoer. Deuteronomy 25:2-2. The court must not exceed the prescribed number of lashes. Deuteronomy 25:3-3. The court must not kill anybody on circumstantial evidence. Exodus 23:7-4. The court must not punish anybody who was forced to do a crime. Deuteronomy 22:26-5. A judge must not pity the murderer or assaulter at the trial. Deuteronomy 19:13-1. A judge must not have mercy on the poor man at the trial. Leviticus 19:15-2. A judge must not respect the great man at the trial. Leviticus 19:15-1. A judge must not decide unjustly the case of the habitual transgressor. Exodus 23:6-2. A judge must not pervert justice. Leviticus 19:15-1. A judge must not pervert a case involving a convert or orphan. Deuteronomy 24:17-2. Judge righteously. Leviticus 19:15-3. The judge must not fear a violent man in judgment. Deuteronomy 1:17-1. Judges must not accept bribes. Exodus 23:8-2. Judges must not accept testimony unless both parties are present. Exodus 23:1-3. Not to curse judges. Exodus 22:27-4. Not to curse the head of state or leader of the Sanhedrin. Exodus 22:27-5. Not to curse any upstanding Jew. Leviticus 19:14-6. Anybody who knows evidence must testify in court. Leviticus 5:1-7. Carefully interrogate the witness. Deuteronomy 13:15-8. A witness must not serve as a judge in capital crimes. Numbers 35:39. Not to accept testimony from a lone witness. Deuteronomy 19:15-10. Transgressors must not testify. Exodus 23:1-1. Relatives of the litigants must not testify. Deuteronomy 24:16-2. Not to testify falsely. Exodus 20:13-3. Punish the false witnesses with the same punishment they were seeking for the defendant. Deuteronomy 19:19-4. Act according to the ruling of the Sanhedrin. Deuteronomy 17:11-5. Not to deviate from the word of the Sanhedrin. Deuteronomy 17:11-6. Not to add to the Torah commandments or their oral explanations. Deuteronomy 13:1. Not to diminish from the Torah any commandments in whole or in part. Deuteronomy 13:1-2. Not to curse your father or mother. Exodus 21:17-3. Not to strike your father or mother. Exodus 21:15-4. Respect your father and mother. Exodus 20:12-5. Fear your father and mother. Leviticus 19:3-6. Not to be a rebellious son. Deuteronomy 21:27. Mourn for relatives. Leviticus 10:19-8. The high priest must not defile himself through contact with a relative. Leviticus 21:11-9. The high priest must not enter under the same roof as a corpse. Leviticus 21:11-1. A Cohen must not defile himself for anyone except relatives. Leviticus 21:1-2. Appoint a king from Israel. Deuteronomy 17:15-3. Not to appoint a convert. Deuteronomy 17:15-4. The king must not have too many wives. Deuteronomy 17:17-1. The king must not have too many horses. Deuteronomy 17:16-2. The king must not have too much silver and gold. Deuteronomy 17:17-3. Destroy the 7 Canaanite nations. Deuteronomy 20:17-1. Not to let any of them remain alive. Deuteronomy 20:16-2. Wipe out the descendants of Amalek. Deuteronomy 25:19-3. Remember what Amalek did to the Jewish people. Deuteronomy 25:17-4. Not to forget Amalek's atrocities and ambush on our journey from Egypt in the desert. Deuteronomy 25:19. 1. Not to dwell permanently in Egypt. Deuteronomy 17:16-2. Offer peace terms to the inhabitants of a city while holding siege, and treat them according to the Torah if they accept the terms. Deuteronomy 20:10-3. Not to offer peace to Ammon and Moab while besieging them. Deuteronomy 23:7-1. Not to destroy fruit trees even during the siege. Deuteronomy 20:19-2. Prepare latrines outside the army camps. Deuteronomy 23:13-3. Prepare a shovel for each soldier to dig with. Deuteronomy 23:14-4. Appoint a priest to speak with the soldiers during the war. Deuteronomy 22:5. He who has taken a wife, built a new home, or planted a vineyard is given a year to rejoice with his possessions. Deuteronomy 24:5-6. Not to demand from the above any involvement, communal or military. Deuteronomy 24:5-1. Not to panic and retreat during battle. Deuteronomy 20:3-2. Keep the laws of the captive woman. Deuteronomy 21:11-3. Not to sell her into slavery. Deuteronomy 21:14-4. Not to retain her for servitude after having relations with her. Deuteronomy 21:14.